It is true that there are multiple reasons in your environment that can trigger the problem in the first place. The problem goes around and around, and finally it ends up here. And once it ends up here, now it's very difficult. Now you need exorcism. Only exorcism can fix that. I'm not affirming a belief in exorcism, I'm just using that as a metaphor. That tells you the intensity of this problem, the immensity of this problem. Problem can begin way back in your childhood, where your parents were not really educating you about certain things very well. Maybe you were slightly overweight, and when you went to elementary school, the discrimination started right there. There's a clique of girls who are popular, who look down upon you, and you develop that sense of rejection that never leaves you alone. It goes with you for the rest of your life. It could be because you grow up, you see more discrimination, your husband wants you to lose weight, he doesn't want to have sex with you, he's going after other women. And just the discrimination alone in society, you know, when a man is big, he's sporty, he's chunky, he's muscular. But when a woman is a little bit overweight, she's slothful, she's lazy. But society has way too many stereotypes. But that doesn't make things better. They make things much worse for you. And it becomes a subtle form of mental illness which you don't know how to deal with. So problem can start in your school, within your own family, in society, expectations of society. And believe it or not, there is a whole segment of society out there which is less fortunate than you are. Do you ever wonder why obesity is much bigger problem in poor population in inner city areas among blacks and Hispanics? Do you ever wonder? Have you ever thought that it could be an economic problem? A person who is worried about paying their rent on the first of the month, don't have a job, they live in dirt and squalor. When they leave the streets, they see crime everywhere. Do you think they're going to worry about diet? They are going to eat the very first thing that comes across. They're going to swing through McDonald's every day. Because that is the least of their problems, to worry about diet and weight. They are not worried about these exotic problems. So there are many environmental, social, economic issues that can contribute. Every person is different. But one way or the other, the problems sneak in and become part of your permanent mental makeup, which is very difficult to deal with. I would like to tell you guys a story. Hopefully this story is motivational and encourage you to do what is necessary to do, lose this weight, and lose it for good. In 1920s, when the science and nutrition and we didn't understand foods and ingredients in food that well, in 1920s, during the First World War, the only thing people knew or doctors knew is, well, you want to lose weight, eat less. Let me ask you another question before I tell you the story. Can any one of you tell me, let's say the problem was not losing weight, the problem was opposite, gain weight. Let's say you were all born in Congo in Africa, and they show you on TV and your ribs are out because there's not enough protein. You are among those starved children. The issue here is opposite now. How do we make these kids gain weight and put some flesh on themselves so they are not prone to disease and infection and virus and bacteria? Their immune system is built up. If, let's say, that was the problem, how would you solve that problem? Thank you. So food, right? You eat, you gain weight. Now, does it make sense to you that if, in order to gain weight, you have to eat food, what do you do if you have to do the opposite? No, I'm not suggesting you starve, okay? But I'm going to try to take you to the root of the problem. Let's get back to the story. So there were some clinics where research was done. They divided people into two groups and put some people on what is called a calorie restriction diet, which in plain, stupid English means you eat less. And the other group was you are going to eat as usual. Most of these studies were either retrospective. Retrospective means you go back and look at where diets were tried, review that data, which is in the charts, and then follow these people. Go track them and see where they are 30 years later in their life. And there was something very surprising that was discovered. And that discovery was that people who did not do that diet, so to speak, almost all of them were already dead. And the ones that were in the program and the ones that were able to maintain it, they were not only alive, a majority of them, but almost none of them had diabetes, blood pressure, they haven't had any strokes, they haven't had any heart attacks. They're living very well. That was very intriguing, if you think about it. And it brings up the question, is it just a coincidence? Kind of doesn't make sense. It's too good to be true. Maybe, there's something coincidental here. We're not really sure what the cause is. It may not be necessarily because you had calorie restriction that you lost weight. That doesn't make sense. In the early 1990s, the governments all over the world became very interested in studying the human genome. And the world was ambitious that we are going to sequence the entire human genome. And your DNA is the blueprint, it's the code, it's the secret language in which everything about you is written. If you could decode that code, it literally tells you everything. It tells you about the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, the shape of your nose, how high you are. And it doesn't only tell you that, it tells you a lot about your behavior. It tells us about our mental illnesses, about schizophrenia, how we function, how we behave, even with our reflexes, if we scratch nose all the time. Everything is written in that code language that determines. Surprisingly, they were able to complete the genome project much earlier than anticipated. I think it was already completed in the year 2000. What was the next step? Now, researchers all over the world they want to find out, now that they have the sequence, now they want to find out which gene does what. Someone wants to find out which gene triggers the so-called Alzheimer's disease. Which gene causes diabetes, blood pressure, obesity, you name it. My 7-year-old son has narcolepsy. It took us like 6-7 years to find the person who discovered the gene in narcolepsy. Now he's the world authority on the subject. So he is my son's doctor at Stanford University. So a gene has been discovered for most conditions, not all of them. Now the next natural step will be, can we change these genes so Alzheimer's doesn't happen, heart attacks don't happen, strokes don't happen? So that's the thing of the near future. But that's not necessary for our discussion. Similarly, there were some folks who were interested, maybe obesity runs in their family, and they are very interested to find out, is there a gene that causes obesity? And like everything else, scientific research always starts with bacteria and virus and yeast, and then you move on and you see if the same genes are in the mice and rat and rodents, and then you move on and try to find the same thing in humans. So they were able to find a gene in yeast cells, which is called Saccharomyces, actually, that's the name of the species. And they found a gene. It turned out that that gene, if it's functional, if it works, and if it's turned on, the yeast cells lives twice as much. That was a very interesting finding. Then they got interested, they looked for the same gene. By the way, that gene in the yeast is called SIR2, S-I-R, like sir, madam, yes sir, same spelling. Put 2 next to it. You are more than welcome to look it up. It was reported in Nature in April of 2009, then again in September of 2009. Anybody knows what Nature is? Nature is a journal, science journal. You guys know anything about it? Nature is the world's most prestigious science journal. It's primarily published in England. This is a journal. People who publish in it, they are already have made a name internationally. They are internationally known in their subject. So you have to be a very distinguished scientist to publish in that. Just because you're a professor at Stanford University doesn't mean anything. You have to come up with a breakthrough, an innovation. It was reported also in some other journals. Many professors and scientists then became very interested, and research started in a big way all over the world, especially in United Kingdom, at Wisconsin University, at Stanford University. And then they started finding that not only that gene exists in rodents and mice and rats. First they went from yeast to Drosophila. Drosophila means fruit fly, basically. They got to the more and more sophisticated animals and see if the same gene exists. Exactly the same gene exists all the way up to humans. And the only difference they found that in mammals there are multiple such genes, and they give it a different name. And the name for this homolog in mammals, including humans, is called SIRT1. You're welcome to look it up. S-I-R, capital T, and put 1 next to it. And write it down. And there are actually SIRT1 to SIRT7. There are 7 genes that have been discovered that participate in this longevity. There was something amazing when they found these genes in mammals, that it doesn't just make you live, rats and mice, twice as long. And why do they do always experiment? You hear about mice and rats. Anybody knows why it's always rats, experiment on rats and mice? Why not on elephants? Anybody knows why that? Sorry?
Prejudice against mice?
Well, I think the primary reason is when you do research like this on an animal, you don't want to do research on an animal who lives 40 years. You have to wait for 40 years to see the results. You want to work on a species that lives to be days or months. Rats live about 2 years. So you can see if they started to live 4 years instead of 2 years by certain intervention. So this has been observed in the labs, that all these smaller species, mammalians, live twice as much. Those of us who have very religious feelings, they say they are mice and rat. We are humans. We are special. I have a news for you. From a scientific perspective, it doesn't matter what species you are. The gene is exactly the same. Atom for atom, molecule for molecule. And it expresses itself in exactly the same way.